today I'm going to be walking through how to make this puff sleeve dress, which is my Cindy pattern. The pattern is available on my Etsy and I'm trying to keep everything as beginner friendly as possible. I've given you two options in the tutorial. Either you can make a version like this, which has a layer of mesh, or you can make a standard, more basic version. So let's get on with the video. So the main fabric that you're going to need for this project is a 4-way stretch fabric. I'm using a 95% cotton, 5% elastane. Anything similar to that will do the job. But I am also going to be using a stretch power mesh. Now this is completely optional. This is just going to go over the top of the normal stretch fabric that I'm using. So you can decide to leave this off, or if you want to try and find some of this yourself, just look for a stretch power mesh. I found this on the Fabric Merchant on Etsy and I got this one from Little Legs Fabric. But if you want to make the most basic version of this project, you will just need a 4-way stretch fabric like this one. I'm also going to be using pins, some fabric scissors to cut out my pieces, some fabric pens to draw out my pieces, some fusible interfacing tape for my hems, some shirring elastic to make my puff sleeves, and an iron. In terms of my sewing machines, I'm going to mainly be using my overlocker. If you don't have an overlocker, you can just use a zigzag stitch on a regular machine as well. And I will also just be using a regular machine with a zigzag stitch for some top stitching and to do the hems. For my pattern, I'm going to be using my Cindy pattern for this one. So I have 5 pieces in total for this pattern. The first one is pattern piece 1, which is the front of the top. Whether you're making the version with mesh or not, you will need 2 pieces of this one. And then I have pattern piece 2, which is the back of the top. Again, you're going to need 2 of these whether you're using mesh or not. So you will either want to have 2 pieces from your normal stretch fabric, or 1 in your normal stretch fabric and 1 in your mesh. But I'll show you every piece that you'll need once I've gone through all the patterns. I have pattern piece 3, which is my puff sleeve. So for this one, you will need 2 in total if you aren't using mesh. If you are using mesh, you will need 2 in your regular stretch fabric and 2 in your mesh fabric. I have pattern piece 4, which is my skirt piece, which is impossible to fit on the screen or the table, but it looks something like this. So I'm just going to cut that to the mini length because that's the length that I want this. So this is how the piece looks once I have cut it to my desired length. So for this one, you're going to want to line up one of these straight edges, either that one or this one, it doesn't matter which one, to the fold of your fabric. And then you'll be able to cut this shape out, and then once you've cut it out, you'll be able to open it out to have a double piece of this. So you want to do that twice if you are using just a regular fabric with no mesh. So you'll have 2 pieces that can fold out to be double the size of this. If you're using mesh, you want to do that an extra 2 times for your mesh as well. But again, I will show you all of this in a minute. And then finally, I have pattern piece 5, which is my pocket piece. If you aren't using mesh, you will just need 4 of these in your regular stretch fabric, but you want to make sure that you cut 2 in this orientation and 2 in this orientation. This won't matter as much if you don't have a fabric with a right or wrong side, but it is a good habit to get into, just so you have 2 pockets for each side. And then if you are using mesh, you just want to repeat that again for your mesh as well. So I just wanted to give a quick example of how to cut the skirt pieces out, just in case you're not sure. So this piece is folded and the fold is up here. So I would just line up one of those straight edges to that fold and draw it in as you normally would. And then once you cut that out, you'll be able to open out a double piece. So I'm going to go in and cut out all the pieces that I need off camera, and then I will come back and show you what you will need in each piece. A quick tip if you are adding mesh in terms of cutting your pieces out of the mesh, because it can be a little bit tricky, is to just take the pieces that you've cut out in your regular stretch fabric and pin them to the mesh and then cut around the shape. That tends to be the easiest way. You will also need to check the direction of your stretch. So my stretch is going in this direction, which is the direction that I want it to go on this skirt, because there is no stretch in the other direction. Also, I have this folded in the same way that I folded the fabric for the skirt as well. So I'm just going to pin all my pieces onto this and then cut them out in my mesh as well. So I'm going to start going through all of the pieces that you're going to need for this project now. So I have 2 pieces for my pattern piece 1, which is the front of your top. I have 1 in mesh, hopefully you can see that on the camera, and 1 in my regular stretch fabric. If you aren't using mesh, you just need 2 in the regular stretch fabric. So then I have 2 pieces in pattern piece 2 as well. It's exactly the same as the other piece for your top. So I have 1 in my mesh and 1 in my regular fabric. If you aren't using mesh, again, you would just want to use 2 in the regular fabric. I should also mention as well, you want to make sure that your pieces in mesh for your top have the stretch running widthways across it. And that's pretty much the same for any pieces that you cut out in mesh. You want to make sure that the stretch goes this way rather than lengthways. And then here I've got pattern piece 3, which is my sleeve. So if you're making the version without mesh, this is all you'll need. You just need 1 piece for each side of the sleeve, so 2 in total. If you are adding mesh, you just want another 2 pieces that are exactly the same, but in your mesh. So you'll have 4 in total, 2 in your regular stretch fabric and 2 in your mesh fabric. And then moving on to pattern piece 4, which is the skirt. So like I said, you want to cut these out on a fold so that you can fold them out to make them twice the size. So if you're making the version without mesh, you'll just need 2 of these in your regular stretch fabric. So I've got my second one here. So I've just changed the angle of the camera a bit so you can see it a little bit better. So I've got 2 in my regular stretch fabric here. So if you aren't adding mesh, this is all you'll need, just 2 that are cut on the fold. If you are adding mesh, you just need exactly the same as I've got here, but in mesh. So another 2 on top of these. So you'll have 2 in your regular fabric and then 2 in your mesh fabric, which again have been cut on the fold so that they are twice the size of the pattern piece. And then I've just got my second one here. So you will have 4 in total if you are adding mesh and 2 in total if you aren't adding mesh. And then finally pattern piece 5, which is the pockets. So if you aren't adding mesh, this is all that you're going to need. 4 pieces for your pocket, 2 facing in this direction and 2 facing in this direction. As I said before, my fabric doesn't have a right or wrong side, so you could put them in either direction, but it is good to get into the habit of cutting them out for each side. And then if you are adding mesh, you want exactly the same as this, but also in mesh. So you'll have 4 in the stretch fabric and another 4 in your mesh fabric. So if you're adding mesh, you'll have 8 pieces in total. If you aren't adding mesh, you will have 4 pieces in total. So I'm going to start by making the front of my top. So I'm going to lay my 2 pieces for my top. So 1 is in my mesh and 1 is in my regular fabric. And I'm going to lay them right sides facing together. This one doesn't have a right or wrong side, but the mesh will be brighter on one side than it is on the other. So that's how I'm going to tell which is my right side. So I'm going to lay them one on top of the other, and I'm just going to pin around that neckline. So now that I've got that neckline pinned in place, I'm just going to sew around that edge with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch, and then I'm going to repeat this exact thing with my pattern piece 2, which is the back of my top. So it's going to be exactly the same, it will just be a slightly higher neckline. So I'm going to do that for both pieces. So I've just sewn that neckline in place, and I've done the same for pattern piece 2, which is the back of the top. I'm going to take this one and turn it to the right side out so that it looks something like this. And then I'm going to place it inside the back of my top. So I'm just going to line up these straps. You want to make sure the same fabrics are facing each other. So I've got mesh facing mesh and then the plain jersey facing the plain jersey. So I'm just going to place that inside this strap. And you've got 4 layers of fabric here, so you want to line all of them up and then pin it in place. I'm going to do the same for the other strap. And that should look something like this once you've got all of your straps pinned in place. I'm just going to sew straight across the top of there with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. So this is how that looks once the top of those straps is sewn in place. I'm just going to turn this to the right side out. And that should look something like this. And now I'm going to put this to one side and start working on my sleeves. So for my sleeve, the first step is only going to be if you are adding mesh. So I'm going to take my mesh layer, and with the right side facing up for both of them rather than facing together. So this is the right side of my mesh and the right side of my jersey fabric. I'm just going to lay them one on top of the other. And then I just want to pin all the way along that top edge and all the way along that bottom edge. And now that those two layers are pinned together, I'm just going to sew straight along that top edge and straight along this bottom edge with my overlocker. As always, you can use a zigzag stitch if you don't have an overlocker. So once you've sewn those two layers together, you can start to gather the piece. So this is where you would come back in if you haven't added mesh. So I'm going to load some shirring elastic into my machine, which I'll show you in a second. And then with a straight stitch, I'm going to sew all the way along this top edge, just keeping as close to that edge as I can. And then I'm going to do the same along the bottom, but this time I'm going to do it 2 inches away from that bottom edge. So just along here like this, just keeping about 2 inches away from that bottom edge. It doesn't have to be precise. You want to make sure that you don't tie off either end or reverse or anything to secure those stitch lines in place, because we're going to use the thread to gather these two sections. So I'll show you how I'm going to do that on my machine. So I've just got the top of the machine set up as normal, all threaded with my normal thread. And then I'm just going to take my shirring elastic and wind it onto my bobbin by hand. You don't want to do this with your machine or it'll come out too tight. So I'm just going to wind that on there like this. And then once you have all of your elastic wound onto your bobbin, I'm just going to load that in as I normally would with any regular thread. And just pick that up with your thread at the top and pull that through. I'm going to set that to a normal straight stitch, and then just taking one of my sleeves, I'm just going to follow along the top edge first. So for this one, I want to keep it nice and close to that top seam. You should be able to see as you're sewing that it starts to kind of gather on its own. And then as you get to the end, like I said, don't reverse or tie it off or anything. Just pull the threads away just to keep them nice and loose. And you want a good amount of this just to make sure it doesn't come undone. So that's how the top of that edge looks. As you can see, it's starting to kind of gather on its own. Now I'm going to move on to the bottom edge. So for this one, I'm going to be doing it 2 inches away from the needle. So I'm just going to use a tape measure to find about where 2 inches is. So it comes to the edge of my grey panel here. So I'm just going to line up that bottom edge to the edge of the grey panel, and then just start to sew another straight line. And again, make sure that you don't reverse or tie any threads off. You just want the threads to be loose. And then that's just how that looks along the bottom edge. So obviously I'm going to gather that a lot more, but that's our starting point to start from. So I'm just going to repeat that for my second sleeve, and then I'll show you the next step. So this is roughly how that will look once you've added your elastic. So now I'm going to grab my pattern. It might be quite difficult to see on camera, but there is a guide on this pattern that is going to show you how much you need to gather the piece to fit it into the armhole of the top. So just here, I've got a bold line at the top and I've got a bold line at the bottom. So I'm going to take my sleeve. I'm just going to start to pull the elastic up one side to slowly gather this edge. You want to be quite careful with this because I have already snapped mine once. Very easy to do. I had to go in and put another stitch line through it. So you just want to gradually gather this until it's short enough that it's the same kind of length as this line here. Now this is going to be quite a rough guide to follow, but as long as it's a similar-ish length, you will be absolutely fine with fitting it into the armhole. So I'm just going to continue to do this and gather that along this top edge. And then once that's about the right length, I'm going to move on to doing this bottom edge as well to make it around the same length as that. So once you've got that so that it's roughly the same size, I would also say it's better to make it slightly smaller than you need rather than bigger, because you can just stretch it while you're fitting it to the armhole. So once it's the size that you need, you can just tie off your threads at the end just to secure these ends. And then once you've done that, you can start to put these into your top. So I'm just going to grab my top piece back and I'm going to lay this piece out flat like this with the right side facing up. I'm just going to find the center point of my sleeve, which isn't the easiest when they're gathered like this. I'm just going to fold it in half and then just mark that center point on the top seam. Just like that. And then I'm going to match that center point up to this top of the strap that we've sewn in place here with right sides of the sleeve facing together with the right side of the top. I'm just going to place a pin where that center point meets the top of the strap that we sewed in place. And then you just want to start to pin the rest of this sleeve around the rest of that armhole. I like to start at the edges. I'm just going to pin furthest edge of that sleeve to the edge of that armhole. Make sure you're getting both layers of both pieces and pin that in place. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. And I'm just going to go in and put some pins in those middle sections so that this sleeve is pinned all the way along that armhole. So that's how that's looking once the sleeve is completely pinned into the armhole. I'm just going to repeat that for my second sleeve and then I'm going to sew that in place with an overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. Just really take your time with this bit, because with all these gathers it can be easy to miss a part because you've got quite a few layers here that you're sewing in place, or it can be easy for the sleeve to move about. So I would recommend using a lot of pins for this part and just really taking your time when you sew it in place. So I've just finished sewing those sleeves in place and now I'm going to fold this with right sides facing together just like this, and I'm going to pin down the side of this sleeve and then down the side of the top. I'm going to do the same on the other side as well. So I've just pinned along those side seams, so just straight up the side of the top and up the side of the sleeve. I'm going to sew those in place with my overlocker. I'm also going to cut some of these threads off as I'm going as well. You can also use a zigzag stitch. Just make sure that you're getting all 4 layers of the fabric in your stitch line. So now that those side seams are sewn in place, I'm just going to turn this top to the right side out. It should look something like this. And now I'm going to move on to make my skirt. So now taking one of my pieces for the skirt, I'm just going to add my pockets. So I'm going to take my pocket and line up the straight edge of the pocket to the straight edge of the skirt with right sides facing together, and that also wants to line up to the top edge of that skirt where the waist is going to go. I'm just going to pin that in place. And I'm just going to repeat that for the pocket on the other side as well. And now that I've got my pockets pinned in place, I'm just going to go in and sew down those straight edges. So just right here with my overlocker, you can use a zigzag stitch as well. And I'm also going to repeat this for any remaining skirt pieces that I've got. So if you're making the version without mesh, you'll just have one more of these and it will look exactly like this. If you're making the version with mesh, you will have a few pieces in that mesh fabric as well. And you want to do this in exactly the same process. Just finished sewing those pockets in place. Now I can fold that out, and I've repeated this for my other pieces in the same fabric. I'm just going to take that second piece, and with right sides facing together, I'm going to lay this on top of my first piece. I'm just going to start to line up all of those edges. Now I'm just going to start to pin these two together. So I'm going to pin along this pocket, around the edge of the pocket, and then down the side of the skirt. I'm going to do that on both sides, and then I'll show you how it looks when it's all pinned together. So I've just finished pinning those edges in place, and now I'm going to go in and sew around both of those sides with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. So this is how that looks once those sides are sewn in place. If you aren't adding mesh, you can just skip to the part where you add your top. But if you are, I just want to turn this to the right side out. And then I've made exactly the same piece but in my mesh, and I'm going to turn that to the right side out as well. And then I'm just going to place this over the top of that normal stretch layer of the skirt, just so it works as a kind of overlay. I'm just going to tuck all the pockets in together to help them sit a bit more nicely. And then I'm just going to pin those two layers together around that waist area. So that's how that will look once it's pinned together. So I'm just going to sew around that with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. And while I'm doing that, I'm just going to fold those pockets out of the way. Just sew straight around that top edge. So this is how that should look once you've attached those two layers of the skirt. Now I'm just going to use a hand stitch to attach these two pockets together. I'm just going to do a small loop just to make sure that they stay inside each other, but that is completely optional. You can skip this part if you want. So I just have my needle threaded with a knot at the end. I'm just going to come in through this side of the skirt. Just pick a spot at the bottom and come through both of those seams. So I want to come through the seam of my regular stretch fabric and then through the seam of my mesh fabric. And then I'm just going to go straight back through both of those seams. And just essentially keep doing that until it feels nice and secure. So now I'm going to come back up through those seams and then back down through them again. So it will be starting to look something like that. Hopefully you can see that. I'm just going to keep doing that a few more times, and then I'm going to go over and do it on the second pocket as well. So once those pockets are secured together, if you've decided to do that, I'm just going to tuck them back in there and turn the skirt to the right side out. And now this is the point that you would join back if you haven't added mesh. Obviously your skirt should already be inside out if that's the case. And I'm going to grab my top. So your top should be the right way out, skirt should be inside out. And I'm just going to place this top inside the skirt, and the top is upside down. And then I'm going to start to match up the bottom of that top around the top edge of that skirt. So it's just going to look like this. So I'm going to start by pinning the side seams in place. Just want to kind of fold those pockets out the way. Just pinning that side seam in place, and same for the other side. And then I'm going to pin the rest of the way around that edge. So I've just finished pinning around that top edge, and I'm going to go in and sew that with my overlocker. You can also use a zigzag stitch. Just take your time to make sure that you get all of your layers in that stitch line, because you will have a few, whether you've got mesh or not. You should have at least 3 or 4. So I've just finished sewing that waistline in place. I just folded the pockets down while I went over that area, and I can turn this to the right side out. So all that's left to do now is to hem the edges and to add a top stitch, which is optional, so you can skip that bit if you like. I have just gone in with my overlocker around the edge of my mesh skirt. I've just done that with a single needle on my overlocker, just because I found that that is the best way to hem this piece while still keeping it nice and flowy. If you don't have an overlocker, you can just fold this edge in on itself and sew around that with a straight stitch, which is essentially what I'm going to be doing on the sleeves as well. So I'll show you how I'm going to do that, and then I will also show you how I'm going to hem any of the plain jersey that we've got. So I'm going to need some interfacing and an iron to do that, and obviously you can do that on the skirt and the sleeves if you haven't used any mesh. So I've just cut a few pieces of my interfacing in half, just so that it's a bit thinner than it is on here, and I'm going to place that at the bottom edge of my regular stretch fabric layer, and just fold that bottom edge up over the interfacing, and then I'm going to take my iron and press that in place. I'm going to do that all the way around the bottom of the skirt. You can also do it on your sleeves if you haven't used any mesh. So it's just going to be like that, and I'm going to go all the way around, and then I'm going to go over the top of it with a zigzag stitch, but I'll show you how it looks when I have pressed all of it so that it's like this. So this is how that hem looks once it's pressed in place with the interfacing. Now I'm just going to go and sew straight over the top of that with a zigzag stitch, and at the same time I'm also going to hem my sleeves. So obviously, like I said, if you have the sleeves without the mesh, you can do it in the same way as I've just done that skirt. But if you have the mesh sleeves, so mine look like this. So they've just got the overlocked edge, and you might also just have this as a zigzag stitch, which is also fine. I'm literally just going to fold that edge in on itself and sew over the top of that with a straight stitch. Just a very, very simple single hem, just folding that edge over and sewing it in place with a straight stitch. You can also do a zigzag if you are worried about the stretch, but this area doesn't tend to stretch much, so I'm just going to use a straight stitch for this one. So that's how that edge should look once it's all sewn in place, and then this is how the hem for the sleeves looks. That is a really nice simple hem to do. And now the final thing that I'm going to do, which is completely optional, is to add a top stitch around the neckline. So I'm literally just going to set my machine to a zigzag stitch and follow around this neckline and then around the back here. You can add top stitching wherever you want. You can also choose to not add top stitching anywhere, but I'm just going to follow around this edge with a zigzag stitch. So I've just added my top stitch around there. I literally just went round with a zigzag stitch going around that seam that I've sewn around that neckline. I'll just zoom in a little bit so you can see a little bit better. So you can just see that zigzag stitch all around the edge, and then once I've added that, my dress is finished.